All right, so it's thrilled to be here, and I'm going to talk about my forthcoming book, Re-Engineering Humanity, which is co-authored with Evan Selinger. So do we know when technology replaces or diminishes our humanity? Can we detect when it even happens? These questions came up in many of the earlier panels, and it was a great setup in a sense. To answer these questions, we'd have to know what constitutes our humanity, and that turns out to be an incredibly difficult question that's been debated without resolution for millennia. And given such difficulty at sort of the most foundational level, it shouldn't be surprising that we don't really have a reliable method for identifying, much less evaluating, technological impacts on our humanity. Of course, people often claim that technologies dehumanize, especially in recent decades with widespread adoption of computers, the internet, and more recently smartphones. But the public generally takes such claims to be alarmist, and so the claims generally remain untested and ultimately drowned out in rampant enthusiasm for new technology. And yet, techno-social engineering of humans exists on an unprecedented scale and scope, and it's only growing more pervasive as we embed network sensors in our public and our private spaces, our devices, our clothing, and increasingly ourselves. So when does technology diminish our humanity? When and how do humans become programmable? Can we even detect when it happens, much less evaluate it? What makes us human? What about being human matters? These are the kinds of questions that Evan and I try to tackle in Re-Engineering Humanity. Here's our table of contents to give you a sense of the kinds of things we talk about. Many of these things came up in different times over the last 2 days. So we argue that we need a method to examine the dynamic relationships between humans and the technologies we develop and use. And at the core, the method we develop in the book depends on a fundamental and radical repurposing of the Turing test. That's the test that Alan Turing famously proposed to examine when a machine can think. And so Turing's test examined the line between humans and machines, focusing on the machine side of the line, and giving rise to the fields of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and various other adjacent technologies. Our book, our analysis examines the human side of the line. So we use machines as a baseline and ask when and how humans behave in a manner that's machine-like along different dimensions with respect to different capabilities. So we're interested in engineered environments. So we begin with different types of intelligence, but our analysis certainly doesn't end there. There's much more to humanity than that. And so the method's extended to different capacities and capabilities, our capability to relate to others, as well as the core concepts of free will and autonomy. And so the radically repurposed Turing tests are plausible tests to employ, but more importantly, I think, the tests serve as conceptual tools that enable a deeper consideration of what makes us human and how our humanity is reflected in and affected by the technologies we develop and use. So throughout the book, the concepts are grounded in familiar examples, things like call centers, the assembly line, public schools, online electronic contracting, wearable technology, social media, and many others. And throughout, we dissect and examine the technosocial environments that we're building and the creeping Taylorist technosocial engineering of humans in the workplace and as it creeps to other contexts where we live our lives. So we play the role of cautious futurists and directly focus on interconnected sensor networks, the so-called Internet of Things, where things is really just a way to talk about humans made into things, or machine-readable humans, rather than the actual devices themselves, and big data-enabled automation of systems around, about, in, and on human beings. But today what I want to focus on is not all of that so much as to focus on the ends. So to grapple with the normative implications of 21st century technosocial engineering of humans, we need to be asking these questions. They're constitutional because they're the most fundamental intergenerational questions that can be asked about what unifies a people, a community, a culture, a society, a civilization. And we can't give definitive answers, and that's okay. Each question's hotly contested. No one can give a definitive answer to these questions for everyone. And so people have different reasonably justified and morally defensible answers to these fundamental questions. Collectively, groups organize their affairs, live their lives according to different sets of responses with different sets of priorities. Still, to advance discussion of these questions, we explain the concept of humanity's techno-social dilemma, drawing a strong parallel with another large-scale tragedy of the commons, that is climate change. Like climate change, or the scenario of climate change, we make an incredible variety of small-scale decisions about technology, adoption, implementation, development, use, and so on, that seem on their own terms perfectly rational and unproblematic, and yet the increments aggregate. And like individual herders who need to decide whether to add another sheep to their flock, we suffer when we fail to account for the systemic effects our decisions have on ourselves and the environments within which we live our lives. So for humanity's techno-social dilemma, the shared resource that's at risk of deterioration and possibly even depletion, we argue is nothing less than humanity itself. And to help frame the normative implications, we discuss Robert Nozick's famous experience machine thought experiment and then our own extension of that thought experiment. I'm going to talk about that with you today. But first, I want to explain our conception of humanity. So it's easy to believe that the meaning of humanity is simple and intuitive and unproblematic. You know it when you see it. It seems that way when we look in the mirror or talk to our children. We're human, and so humanity must be that which we are, or those who are like us are. This sort of common sense view lulls us too easily into believing that what matters about being human, that is what's special and important and worth protecting and cherishing, is whatever we happen to be in the present. What is what ought to be. And on this view, humanity is too easily taken as a given, stable and safe, as if it's a persistent and seemingly inevitable and natural state of affairs. Proponents of this view risk being profoundly ignorant, however, about history. It obscures what the present generation has inherited from past generations and their sacrifices, turns a blind eye to incredible cultural variations within the present generation, and turns a blind eye to how our actions in the present affect future generations. And so frankly, it perpetuates a lack of imagination about possible futures for humanity in the worlds we are, one way or another, building. And so some would say that what it means to be human can be described biologically. That's one approach. And we might identify distinguishable evolved characteristics and capabilities of Homo sapiens. Right? Only Homo sapiens have evolved the complex cognitive and social capabilities needed for widely shared language, fiction, and other social institutions that scale beyond small, close-knit groups. And these basic capabilities and social infrastructure are what enabled humans to conquer the earth and reconstruct the environment within which we evolve, and thereby re-engineer ourselves. And this descriptive biological approach does have the advantage of being scientific. It can help us identify or reveal a set of functions that relate human beings with other species as well as our natural environment, but it has significant limitations. Biology doesn't explain everything about humanity. It can't account for the complex and nuanced ways in which we relate to and evolve within our reconstructed built environments. Biology doesn't explain the tools we choose to build and use, much less whether, how, when, or why we would engineer ourselves through our technosocial tools. It's precisely because we've evolved to the point where we can shape ourselves and our society over time and over generations that we can even engage with these types of questions. So human beings can contemplate and act upon these questions only because of the various capabilities we've gained through evolution and, this is critical, and practiced, owned, developed, and sustained collectively. They're not inevitable, inevitably durable, or inherently resistant to technosocial engineering. They can be gained and lost. And so here's where we end up coming out on this question, or this issue, is what meaningfully distinguishes Homo sapiens is certainly might be our capability to imagine, conceptualize, and engineer ourselves and our environment. What matters about being human is how we exercise such power over generations to collectively produce, cultivate, and sustain shared normative conceptions of humanity. And on this view, humanity might be understood as a set of ideals about who we are and who we aspire to be. In this sense, these ideals are valuable and tangible resources, particularly when shared, acted upon, and reflected in our most sacred institutions as shared commitments. Ultimately, humanity as a normative concept as well as a collectively produced and shared resource stems from the answers we give to these fundamental questions again. conceived of as a shared set of ideals reflected in us and our built world of imagined realities, institutions, infrastructures, and environments, humanity's at risk, we suggest by pervasive technosocial engineering. And so we focus on specific forms of technosocial engineering that affect basic capabilities that enable us to ask and participate in answering these fundamental questions of who we are and who we aspire to be, both individually and collectively. And so we consider thinking capacities, the ability to socialize and relate to each other, free will, autonomy, and agency. And certainly some will disagree inevitably with our choices of capabilities to examine, and they can certainly choose to examine others. The framework we develop actually is adaptable to different kinds of capabilities. But the bottom line is that across cultures and generations, humans have engineered themselves and their built environments to sustain these and other core capabilities. And again, in our view, they're part of our shared heritage, our humanity. And yet they're at risk of being whittled away through rampant technosocial engineering, which is what we refer to as humanity's technosocial dilemma. I don't have the time to explain the forces and the mechanisms. We consider the idea of a slippery sloped path, various creep phenomena, including surveillance creep, boilerplate creep, nudge creep, and other examples of technosocial engineering creep. Many different forces and logics drive us down the path. We've heard about some of them over the last 2 days. Taylorism extended, fetishized computational power, the allure of ever more powerful intelligence-enabled control systems, promise tremendous gains in efficiency and productivity, along with the convenience and happiness of optimized lives. And so this is where, at least we think, the pair of experience machine thought experiments usefully frame the most important normative issues that we need to collectively deliberate. And so Robert Nozick wanted to understand well-being, and he wondered whether he or anyone else would choose to plug into the experience machine, a hypothetical machine that would convincingly simulate any desired experience, right? You could plug in and it would let you take on the role of a renowned novelist, a caring father, a saint, all of the above, whatever makes you happy. Nozick imagined a huge mainframe computer, which sort of makes sense given the time. Now it seems safe to say they envisioned the wrong type of machine. But remarkably, he wasn't off in other important respects. He imagined super-duper neuropsychologists who'd supply us with the sensations we crave. Remarkably, today, technologists, entrepreneurs, and policymakers import scientific insights about how minds work and can be manipulated into their projects and their business plans. Knowledge from cognitive science, psychology, marketing, and behavioral economics guide how technologists and social engineers design contemporary computer programs, architect technical systems, and create human-computer interfaces. So Nozick invented this thought experiment to challenge hedonism, and he contended it'd be a mistake to plug in. His core conviction was that reality has intrinsic prudential value. No matter how realistic a simulated world feels, it lacks the features of an independent reality that's conducive to human flourishing. It's a fully engineered reality, a programmed world where our actions wouldn't be meaningful. Our accomplishments, including caring for others, would be hollow. Fortunately, we wouldn't realize any of this while living on the machine because we'd be programmed to be oblivious to such concerns. But we'd feel really, really good. To plug into the experience machine would be to accept engineered determinism and know, even if only at the moment of deliberation about whether or not to plug in, that any subsequent experience of free will would be illusory. Many people highly value free will. Arguably, it's one of the most fundamental blessings of humanity, collectively cultivated and sustained across generations through the cultures, institutions, infrastructures, and environments we build and sustain. So the experience machine thought experiment usefully highlights competing value systems. It prompts deliberation about what matters to you about your life. Sure, hardcore hedonists would choose to plug in. Most other folks would not. And here's why, in our view. At the most basic level, life on the experience machine simply doesn't jibe with how most people answer the basic constitutional questions. Even though we understand that much of what we do and who we are are products of things that are outside of our control, we don't see ourselves, our lives, or our reality as fully programmed or determined. nor do we aspire to such a fate. But do we aspire to build such a world for our children and for future generations? Notably, this is a moral question that's outside the scope of Nozick's thought experiment. To see why, consider the importance of the cord and the plug. The decision about whether to plug into the machine serves a few purposes. It kept the thought experiment focused on an individual decision about an individual's life. It prompts deliberation by that individual about that individual's conception of what constitutes a good life for that individual. It eliminated concerns about paternalism, social engineering, and even social welfare altogether. It implied the existence of multiple worlds, at least worlds on and off the machine. So let's eliminate the plug and consider a distributed version of the experience machine. The experience machine N.0, the Internet of Things version, I suppose. If you were given the ultimate decision-making authority, would you build such a machine world? Moving from a decision about whether you should plug in yourself to a decision about building a machine world for all humans complicates the analysis, and it shifts the focus from individual well-being to broader moral, political, and social concerns. To make the situation less abstract, let's be very clear about what we mean. Assume that the experience machine N.0 supplies all human beings on Earth with maximum happiness, measured moment by moment for each individual and aggregated over their lifetime at minimal social cost. You have to admit, it sounds pretty darn good. Optimal happiness appears to be an end worth pursuing. But we've got to ask, what about the means? Do they matter? Guided by the optimization criterion of maximum happiness at minimal social cost, the machine necessarily would engineer human beings. After all, human beings are inefficient and costly to sustain. Optimization would entail minimization of various costs associated with humans being human. So, for example, our bodily and mental engagement with the physical world entails logistical, navigational, and various other transaction costs. Outsourcing to intelligence-enabled control systems would minimize or could minimize these costs. Making decisions, experimenting, and learning, among other mental processes, are also costly endeavors. Again, the optimizing logic kicks in. Interacting with each other, coordinating behaviors, developing relationships, and many other aspects of interdependent human relations all entail transaction costs that could be minimized. But there's an even subtler type of techno-social engineering in play that we might want to consider. Since what makes us happy is in large part contingent upon environmental conditions and experiences, and since those factors, again, are fully determined within the machine world, optimization would also entail the engineering of tastes, beliefs, preferences, and other factors that feed into or inputs into our affective feelings of pleasure. So to put it very bluntly, the cheapest way to make billions of human beings perfectly happy is to set the bar very low. The technosocial system need only meet or barely surpass expectations. As hedonists know and often are prone to emphasize, people adapt their beliefs, preferences, and expectations to their conditions, and subsequently, their corresponding happiness levels tend to adjust. And so the goal might very well be to shape beliefs, preferences, and expectations in a manner that makes supplying happiness as cheap and easy as possible. Optimal happiness boils down to satiation of engineered will. So again, I'll ask, would you build it? And I'll say, I would not. Building the experience machine N.0 is functionally equivalent to forcing everyone to plug in to Nozick's experience machine. And in my view, such paternalism conflicts directly with long-standing ideals concerning free will, autonomy, and agency, again, which are shared by many cultures and widely regarded as fundamental blessings of humanity. Indeed, the experience machine N.0 would pose a threat to the liberal democratic ideal that people should be free to choose their own ends with minimal interference. A world that makes it very hard or impossible to opt out would violate this ideal by interfering too strongly with our capacity to set our own ends. And in my view, such interference is morally wrong and should be politically resisted. But again, what do you think? Would you build it? Think hard. Lest you think I'm setting up a straw man or an indefensible position, I want to emphasize that optimal happiness for everyone on Earth is absolutely an end worth considering very carefully, particularly in light of how much misery and suffering exists in this world. And so I posed this thought experiment, for example, to Peter Singer, a renowned philosopher, an incredibly thoughtful and generous person. And after discussion and deliberation, he said he had the following response, which he agreed, he said I could share with you. Right? So I'm a sufficiently hardcore hedonist to think democracy is a means to an end. Essentially, if you can actually imagine achieving optimum happiness, I would build it. Of course, the thing about thought experiments is that they're designed to prompt deliberation, to get you to thinking about what really matters. They're not predictions, and so you might be doubtful that we don't have much to worry about, or I guess get excited about, depending on your view. We're a long way off from building the experience machine N.0. Perhaps, probably, and yet we may be on the slippery slope path to a world or some version of it. And again, therein lies humanity's techno-social dilemma. As with climate change, we need to identify and appreciate the dilemma, which among other things requires us to confront those basic constitutional questions: what matters about being human, and the ends that shape the worlds we're building, one way or another. And so we develop a framework for solutions that help create friction on the path, something that came up earlier, that mitigate techno-social engineering creep, that might help us to identify and make possible alternative paths and futures, but it's hardly a comprehensive solution set. We start at the level of ideals, a freedom to be off and a freedom from engineered determinism. Perhaps sanctuary is another way to sort of frame and think about it at a high level ideal. We talk about resurrecting humanism as a movement, as environmental humanism, recognizing that humanity depends upon the built environments, the environments that we build, and there's a dynamic relationship between us and the environments within which we live. We talk about the ends and values commitments that we have, which again, here for us at least, is human flourishing and capabilities. And then we move into logics and strategies. I've seen the moment, I got a minute left, or I had a minute left about 2 minutes ago, so I don't have any time. But we outlined a number of different strategies, some of which actually connect interestingly with a lot of the points that have come up earlier today. Things like neutrality rules to regulate intelligent-enabled control systems. That's really what net neutrality on the internet's about, if you think hard about it, or I can explain. But we'll need such things in smart homes and smart grids and smart transportation systems. Obfuscation, I don't know where Helen is. I can't really see. I'm in my mode. Where are you? There, you're right in front of me. So we talk about Helen's work there. A whole bunch of other things that we might be able to do. Engineering transaction costs and inefficiencies is another way to think about it. Thanks for listening.